Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 13th treatise delivered this 30th of May 2020. Our topic today is basically about the quagmire of the deputy presidency. Now, today's topic is informed by happenings in the country surrounding the deputy president of the Republic of Kenya, Dr. William Ruto. And as we all know, the position of the deputy president is anchored in our constitution, so that how the holder of that office operates, how he executes his functions, more so given the fact that he is a heartbeat away from the presidency, is crucial to all of us Kenyans, at least from a constitutional perspective. I do honestly believe that this is a treatise that we need to interrogate. I mean, notwithstanding the fact and whether someone is a supporter or otherwise of the current holder of the office, this discussion is one that I believe is important for the sake of the posterity of our nation. Now, in looking into this particular topic, I want us to first start by appreciating that our nature of governmental system, especially insofar as the exercise of executive authority is concerned, mirrors the American presidential style of government. So that it would be important that first we look at how the office of the vice president has and in fact currently operates within the context of the American Constitution. Then thereafter we shall delve in the scenario back in Kenya, so that we can then be in a position to give a honest opinion after a critical outlook in terms of how should or ought our deputy presidents to operate. Now, within the context of the American constitutional dispensation, the vice president is ordinarily elected as a package together with the president. In other words, when a presidential, after the nomination of a presidential candidate by the respective party, the next step that follows is his nomination of his deputy, or rather his vice president, and these two persons would then proceed as a package in the presidential election. Now, you find that the American Constitution basically is clear in terms of the roles that are to be played by the vice president. For instance, one, and that is paramount, the vice president is ordinarily taken to be a heartbeat away from the presidency, in the sense that in the event of a vacancy in that office of the president, and the vacancy can occur either because of the impeachment of the president, or where the president is incapacitated for one reason or another, then the vice president automatically assumes the office of a president. In fact, it's important to note that within that jurisdiction, 14 vice presidents have succeeded to take over from the sitting presidents because of one reason or another. Other than the fact that this person is a heartbeat away from the presidency, the vice president in the United States also has an important constitutional duty, in the sense that he is the president of the Senate. In this duty, the role is more or less ceremonial, and in fact it's so much apparent, especially when it comes to casting of the lot, especially in a scenario where there's a tie within the Senate. It's also important to note that the vice president also plays a critical role when it comes to the tallying of electoral college votes after every presidential election has been held. So you find that those are important critical duties that are vested constitutionally upon the holder of the office of the vice president in this particular country. However, it's also critical to note that there are also some of those roles which may not necessarily be anchored in the Constitution, and apparently it is these roles which are not clearly defined in the Constitution but are ordinarily donated by the president, and which I would here refer to as real constituting real power that ordinarily define clearly the face of a vice president in this particular country. And it's important to note that this would therefore bring in the critical role of the camaraderie or the closeness in terms of the relationship between the president and his vice president, so that in a scenario where these two persons are close, then there is always that tendency of a president to give quite a number of substantial work, donate quite a number of substantial work to his vice president, and it can extend to maybe advisory roles, at times representing him in governmental, intergovernmental functions, and the list is just endless. And this is important because, again, as we'll realize that American presidents also have and enjoy what can be described as, what I can describe as the exercise of executive authority through executive orders. Now, an explanation of this is that ordinarily when presidents take over, they take over based on their particular manifesto, such that a president would therefore have a blueprint through which he would achieve his manifesto. And to do this, in the event that he finds stumbling blocks, maybe through the Congress, then one of the easiest ways through which the president can have his way is through the usage of what has come to be known as executive orders. And through the carrying out of these orders, president have managed to do a lot in terms of realizing what are their flagship projects and visions by the time they are voted in as presidents. It is therefore important to note that within the context of America, we have had, or rather they have had, vice presidents who are known to have had very good relationships with their presidents, so that the presidents would then, as it were, vest them with a lot of what can be described as real power, at times even through the executive orders. And here I can give examples of the Bill Clinton presidency, where Bill Clinton and his vice president Al Gore were known to be so close and tight, and they operated together seamlessly. The same has also been said of the Obama presidency, the relationship between President Barack Obama and his vice president Joe Biden. And you will also realize that both presidents that I have indicated actually served their complete 2 terms of 8 years. However, it is also important to note that America has also experienced scenarios where we've had presidents whose relationship with the vice presidents were not known to be all that much close. And one of the examples that I would want to give today is the one of the 1960 presidential ticket. And here I have in mind the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, also known as JFK, and his Vice President, that was Lyndon Baines Johnson, also known as LBJ. And this is a relationship that was crafted out of the Democratic primaries, where both actually contested. And in this particular primary elections, you had the novice Kennedy, who was a senator, but managed to galvanize the youth vote. And we also had LBJ, who had served for quite some time in the Senate, and in fact was the Senate majority leader at that particular time. But as it happened, ultimately JFK succeeded and became the presidential candidate, thereby nominating LBJ as his running mate, and ultimately, of course, the Vice President of the United States of America. And as it turned out, during Kennedy's presidency, it is said that LBJ was a very ambitious vice president, and in fact, he expected his role as a vice president to be clearly defined and with the proper authority. In fact, it's claimed that he presented the president with quite a raft of executive orders for signing, which would have, ensured that his role and position as vice president was well cemented with the proper and, real authority. And of course, the president is said not to have, been keen to do that, so that we realize a relationship that is said not to have been that much proper, as the vice president felt so much out of place. He felt that he was really not delivering in terms of making proper use of the office, and having that real power that would enable him to deliver as he would have wished to do. And of course, as fate would have it, ultimately in the fateful November of 1963, President JFK was shot and actually assassinated, with the consequence, of course, that the vice president then had to come in as the president, and that's how LBJ found himself as the 36th president of the United States of America. So that given that brief outlay of how things have panned out within the American presidential system, I want us to come back to our country, Kenya. And within this context, I would want us to look at the relevant constitutional provisions that would then tell us what exactly is expected of the deputy president. What are the powers of the deputy president? How is the deputy president expected to relate with the president? And to this extent, I want us to look at especially three particular articles of the Constitution. I have in mind Article 131, Article 132, and Article 147. Now, Article 131 is critical in the sense that, in as much as it talks about the powers of the president, but at 131 sub Article 1 mentions the aspect that the president is expected to be assisted by his deputy, the deputy president. Now, my core interest is in the word assisted. Would it therefore mean, would this be interpreted to mean that it is upon the president to choose when he feels that he needs the assistance of his deputy when it comes to execution of his constitutional functions, when it comes to execution of his executive authority. Yeah, and I want us to look at this. Even as we look at this, I also want us to picture Article 132 of the Constitution, and particularly the aspect that also touches on the powers of the president, and specifically where it states that the president has got powers in terms of looking at the implementation and the running of the ministries and departments within the government. Why? Because this actually is the core of government. As you realize, when you look at the departments, when you look at the ministries that constitute the government, then all the segments, anything that government does that you may think of, are captured within these departments, they are captured within these ministries, so that when you are in control in terms of coordination of these particular ministries, in terms of directing these ministries, then essentially you are in charge technically of the government. So that's what Article 132 gives the president, so that when you look at it vis-a-vis Article 131 that we talked of, that the president, the deputy president, is envisaged to be in a position to assist the president insofar as this aspect of directing and implementing, directing and coordinating departments and ministries or governments are concerned. Then can it be said that it all depends on what the president has directly assigned the deputy president to do? Or I mean, can he just wake up and purport to be doing that particular function because the Constitution says that he ought to assist the president? Yeah. However, I find that the term assistant, to assist, seems to be quite weak, in the sense that in my estimation and in my understanding, it would basically imply that it would mean that the deputy president would only come in where the president feels that he needs assistance, or he needs the deputy president to fill some gap somewhere, right? Even as we look at those two articles, then I would also want us to take a look at Article 147. Now, 147 is important because you see now this one talks of specific powers of the deputy president as enshrined in the Constitution, and I want us to take a look at where it specifically states that the holder of this office shall deputize the president in the execution of these functions. And I tend to think that the framers of the Constitution must have had a reason as to why they talked of deputizing and not assisting. Yeah, and most of where they say shall deputize. It seems to be a statement that was rather something that is couched in a mandatory fashion, so that the president may really not have an option, in the sense that when he is not in a position to exercise a particular function, then it would seem he is mandated to have the deputy president come in to cover for that which he is not in a position to do. Now you realize that that's the fluid position in which these different articles of the Constitution and their interpretation would now come in when we address the Quagmire, in which Kenyans know that the current deputy president apparently finds himself in. Remember when we talked of the American presidential system, I mentioned something about executive orders, which are ordinarily used by presidents to exert their authority, their executive authority upon which they are vested by the Constitution. Now, it is important to note that the same trend also applies in Kenya, so that presidents in Kenya would also issue executive orders to assist them in perpetuating their manifestos and visions, by virtue of them being heads of the executive arm of governments. And now, this question is important, especially in the perspective of Kenya, bearing in mind that the current president of Kenya, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, by virtue of Executive Order number 1 of 2019 on reorganization of government, which created a cabinet committee that was expressly vested with the power to coordinate, to direct and coordinate operations of all government ministries and departments. So by virtue of that particular executive order, the president of Kenya created a team, and apparently that particular team is chaired pursuant to that executive order by the cabinet secretary in charge of internal security and coordination of national government. Now, this is an interesting scenario if you bear in mind Article 147 of the Constitution, and as well as Article 131 that we had previously mentioned. Article 147 is crucial because it would then mean that the cabinet, the person who chairs that particular committee that was created pursuant to that executive order, now happens to be the one who can then be said to be, representing the president in that core mandate of directing and directing and coordinating the government ministries and departments, so that by virtue of that single executive order, it comes out clear that by the stroke of a pen, the deputy president of Kenya somehow, had what can be said to be his core role as envisaged under Article 147 of the Constitution taken over from him. In fact, a good number of Kenyans would recall that prior to this, the deputy president was known to be moving throughout the country, apparently to inspect development projects, and precisely he was moving around the country overseeing how the government ministries and departments had implemented projects. Now, this is the exact task that, pursuant to that executive order, was vested in that committee that is chaired by none other than a cabinet secretary, in a cabinet where apparently the deputy president also sits. And of course, pursuant to this, you therefore see a scenario where, as Kenya, we now have a deputy president, but one who lacks real authority, one who lacks real power. Yeah? Therefore, bringing us to the question that we raised at the very instance, at the first instance of this particular discourse, that how can this quagmire of the position of deputy presidents be addressed? I mean, it's also important to note, and I think you need to bear that in mind, that executive orders by the president are legal documents, though of course courts in Kenya have had opportunity to interpret the efficacy of such orders, and in fact in the case of Milimani constitutional petition number 238 of 2016, that was a case of Bala versus the Attorney General. The High Court addressed itself convincingly that such orders would be unlawful, invalid, insofar as they flout constitutional provisions. They must run in tandem with the Constitution. Of course, if they do that, then they are part and parcel of our laws, because again we have to appreciate that the president, being head of the executive arm of government, being a person that was elected by the people pursuant to a manifesto, and who therefore has to present a scorecard by the end of his term in 5 years, is under duty to take all precautions and put in place mechanisms through which he has to ensure that he delivers on the manifesto that he promised to the people. So that, ladies and gentlemen, looking at that entire context as we have put it, it would then seem to me as an individual that the efficacy of a deputy president would depend so much on the nature of the relationship that exists between these two persons. I still do not know how it can be possible to legislate, or for that matter legally enforce even the powers of a deputy president. It seems to me that because these are persons who are packaged as one, then in one way or another it's only fair that holders of these particular offices must be persons who have got some deep relationship, maybe in terms of ideology and even in terms of how to move how they are going to deliver. And it would also seem that it must be such that the president must be very comfortable with the person that he has as his deputy, and this must be a person who must be ready to lay down his ambition and at times even his beliefs, just for purposes of ensuring that in the end of the day his boss succeeds in his position. In conclusion of this particular treatise, I want to say that it is critical to us as a nation that even as we go to the next dispensation, be it after a referendum or a constitutional change through a parliamentary system or whatever it is, but it would be important that we ensure that the persons that are elected to these two core positions, and in fact this goes to the political parties at the times when they choose candidates, that is for president and his running mate, I would ask that it is important that all cards must be placed on the table, so that the deputy must be very clear in his mind that in as much as you have an ambition, but the thing is that for the time frame of your electoral cycle, your number one objective must be to ensure that you deliver as a team, to ensure that in the end of the day you safeguard the legacy of the president, because anything short of that might then compromise that relationship, and once that relationship is seamless, then the president may as well just decide not to be assisted by his deputy and to rely on the other members of the executive, particularly the cabinet, who are also envisaged under Article 131 to be persons that are expected to be assisting the president in exercising his executive authority. Of course, to the president, it is also important to note that it would be key that for purposes of posterity, for purposes of giving teeth to the Constitution, and this I mean for the sake of the future generation, it is important that the presidents always at least assign their deputies roles, so that the spirit of the Constitution, as envisaged in the fact that they were elected as a package, as a team, is brought to fruition, and also so that there is that aspect of stability within the nation, because as we all know, at a time where there seems to be serious division and no parity between the president and his deputy, the same cannot be said to be auguring well even to the nation, and also bearing in mind that the president especially is expected to be a symbol of national unity, and that I tend to believe must first reflect within the context of the presidency, which encompasses both the president and his deputy, before it even spreads to the other arms of government and the length and breadth of the country. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And in conclusion, I want to say that we have some questions, that we have at least a question that I have posed to they that have listened to this treatise today. There will be a present to the first three who shall get the correct answer to this particular question. And our question is, how many deputy presidents has Kenya had since independence? Thank you.